every tyranny, every oppressive dictatorship has at some point come to an end. And what gives me great hope in the African context and in the recent historical context is that the countries that have been absolutely ravaged by socialism and communism were able to recover from the total destruction of those economic systems within a generation.
Welcome to another IATP Explainer. This week we are joined by Martin van Staden. Martin is the Deputy Head of Policy Research at the Institute of Race Relations in South Africa. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of the Rational Standard and Editor-at-Large of Being Libertarian. He has written several peer-reviewed academic articles, and in 2019, Martin published his book titled The Constitution and the Rule of Law. What is expropriation without compensation, and why has it dominated headlines in South Africa over the last 4 years or so?
So South Africa has a long history of difficult property relations, given our apartheid system and segregation before that. That has generated a lot of racial tension in how property is distributed between Black South Africans and white South Africans and South Africans of other races. And that meant that when South Africa became a democracy in 1994, that the land question, as it is often called, was going to be very high on the agenda. And it has been since then. One of the most radical proposals, certainly there were liberal proposals and liberal initiatives, of course, to give property that was taken illegitimately and non-consensually by previous governments back to their real owners. And these are policies, obviously, that a person such as myself definitely supports. But one of the more radical proposals that comes from the left of the political spectrum has been this notion of expropriation without compensation. One needs to look at what Zimbabwe, South Africa's northern neighbor, did in the late 1990s, early 2000s, to see where the inspiration for EWC in South Africa comes from. There, Robert Mugabe, when his government ran out of money and was unable to pay former military veterans who fought against the Rhodesian government there, President Mugabe decided that the land of white farmers would simply be taken, expropriated without compensation, whereas in ordinary expropriation law, market-based compensation must always be paid. And this led to, of course, radical readjustment in Zimbabwe's property relations profile. So white Zimbabweans owned significantly less property, and South African socialists were very heartened by this. Now, despite the fact that Zimbabwe's economy crashed almost immediately thereafter, as the total disregard for private property rights led to investment pouring out of the country, sanctions being imposed on the country, hunger, inflation, and all the other various consequences of that policy that one can imagine did come to fruition there. But South Africa's socialists were very inspired by this because it achieved what they wanted, which is for the proportion of racial ownership to change radically. And in 2017, the governing party of South Africa, the African National Congress, at its leadership conference, resolved that expropriation without compensation would become one of its central policy pillars. And the South African Parliament, which is obviously dominated by the ANC, affirmed this a few months later in February of 2018.
Has the Constitution been changed to allow for expropriation without compensation? If not, could it soon?
After a 2-year-long process wherein it was proposed for South Africa's constitution, specifically Section 25, which is the property rights provision in the Bill of Rights, to be amended to allow for expropriation without compensation, the third largest political party in parliament, the EFF, or Economic Freedom Fighters, pulled out and decided that the African National Congress, the ANC's proposal to amend that provision simply did not go far enough. The EFF wanted wholesale nationalization of private property, and the ANC only wanted to allow government to expropriate property without compensation. and the EFF withdrew its support, which the ANC counted on, which meant that in December 2021, when everyone was expecting the vote to be on the constitutional amendment, there was no vote because the ANC knew that it did not have the required two-thirds support in the National Assembly, the lower house of parliament. However, what the ANC has done is shifted its focus away from amending the constitution to ordinary legislation. So South Africa has always had an Expropriation Act, which is normal legislation. It has nothing to do with the constitution, which allows government to take private property in exchange for usually market-based compensation. So the current Expropriation Act in South Africa is the Expropriation Act of 1975. So it is clearly a piece of legislation that is pre-democratic. It is from the so-called apartheid era in South Africa's history. So everyone in South Africa today basically agrees that South Africa needs a new Expropriation Act that is aligned to the values in the Constitution, which includes, of course, the protection of private property rights. So liberals broadly and conservatives agree we need a new Expropriation Act. Now, of course, socialists and communists and statists also agree that South Africa needs a new Expropriation Act, but they have something very different in mind. And what they've proposed since the new Expropriation Act has been on the agenda, I think, since about 2015, has been to make expropriation significantly easier for the government than it was even during the apartheid era, to allow government to more easily take private property. Now, since expropriation without compensation has been part of our discourse, the government also included a provision in the expropriation bill, which has now been revised multiple times, to allow government to seize property without being required to pay compensation, certainly market-based compensation. So the expropriation bill as it currently exists, I believe it's the 2020 version, allows government to determine in an open-ended list of circumstances that it will not pay any compensation whatsoever. Certainly it can vary compensation to significantly below market level, but it's also been empowered in the bill to pay nothing whatsoever. So the bill lists 5 circumstances, which includes, for instance, if the property has been abandoned or the owner does not have control of the property, then it may be expropriated without compensation. Land held for speculative purposes may be expropriated without compensation. But this list should not confuse anyone because it's an open list. The provision says that these 5 circumstances and others that the government may deem appropriate in the circumstances. So the government, and specifically the ANC's ministers, have been very clear about the fact that they only wanted the constitution to be amended to make clear what is already implicit in the constitution to them and to legal academics and thinkers. Some of them, the constitution already allowed for expropriation without compensation, which is nonsense if you have a basic comprehension of English and you can read the provision which says compensation is necessary. But the government certainly thinks that this was already allowed and that if it could amend the constitution, it would simply make it clear that it's allowed. So the fact that the government failed in December of 2021 to amend the constitution was not seen as a significant setback. The president and the justice minister and the minister of public works have all gone on record to say that we still believe that the constitution already allows us to do this. So we are going ahead with the expropriation bill to replace the old Expropriation Act. And in terms of that bill, government will be empowered in given circumstances and in an open-ended way to expropriate private property when it deems it to be in the public interest. The courts, of course, will be able to review such expropriations, but the act or the bill, when looked at as a whole, clearly tries to make it as difficult as possible for property owners to defend themselves. So one provision that I can name off the top of my head is that if the government comes to expropriate your property, whether with compensation at below market value or without any compensation, yes, you can challenge it in court, but first you have to give the government the property. So you would think that the fair provision would be that the property is only handed over to government after any court challenges have been concluded. And the court has said, no, everything has been, the law has been complied with. This is a valid expropriation. You must hand it over to government. You would think then, yes, the owner must hand it over to government. But the bill in its current form says, no, if the government says we're expropriating, hand it over. And then we go to court. And then if we lose, you can get your property back. So in reality, of course, if you're not uber rich, extremely wealthy, and we are a developing state, there are very few people that are wealthy enough to hand over their property, which might be generating their very livelihood, then go to court, pay expensive lawyers' fees over many years, and then get the property back. Most property owning South Africans cannot comply with a provision of this nature. It would simply be wiped out the moment they have to hand over their property. So yes, the constitution has not been amended, but expropriation without compensation as a legal concept is still very much on the agenda, and it's still very much a threat in terms of the currently proposed expropriation bill, which should, if it is to be adopted, probably be adopted during 2023. As the ANC would want to claim the adoption of legislation of this nature as a victory going into the 2024 general election. So we are closely monitoring this legislation, and we expect movement on it this year.
Why are strong property rights necessary for a functioning economy and state? What will happen if they are undermined?
Strong and protected private property rights have been the necessary ingredient to every successful society in recent memory. There has not been one example that I can think of any society that has reached a level of prosperity that is comparable to what many in the West today experience without that strong proprietary basis. Socialist states and communist states certainly have not come close. It is only in circumstances where individuals, families, communities are able to own property, to say this is mine, this is ours, and utilize that property to generate welfare for themselves, that widespread social prosperity can result. And we see the evidence for this in annual indices like the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World annual report, or even the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index. You can use both these indices, which are routinely criticized as being conservative propaganda. You don't have to take them at their word. You can take these indices and cross-check them with more, let's call it left-wing or left-focused indices like the United Nations Human Development Index. You can look at Freedom House's Freedom of the World Index. You can look at various rule of law indices and just compare them with these two economic freedom indices. And you will see almost without exception that the countries that have high rates of rule of law compliance, that have high rates of human development, that have low rates of infant mortality, that have high rates of nutrition, that have high rates of social mobility, all these other things usually correspond with states that rank very highly in economic freedom indices. The countries that protect private property rights, the countries that respect freedom of contract, the countries that allow people to engage in economic activity without being micromanaged by government central planners. It is usually those countries that produce good outcomes across the board, social and economic outcomes across the board for their people. So private property rights are absolutely crucial, but not only for prosperity, but also for democracy. And this is something that's not often thought about. one of my colleagues and a mentor of mine in jurisprudence, Professor Kues Malan, has written very ably on this topic, and that is to say that without that property basis that civil society and citizens rely upon, democracy simply is a word without substance. When your next meal is dependent upon government discretion, or if your very ability to work simply depends on keeping a minister happy, there is no way for you to exercise your constitutional function as a citizen in a democracy, to keep government accountable, to ensure that civil liberties are respected. One can just think that a convention center, if it hosts the official opposition's national conference, and the government using expropriation powers to expropriate the convention center because the people there have now undermined the government or the national interest, you can imagine that democracy cannot survive that. You need private property for the ability to tell government no. It's always been the case that when there is a large land owning citizenry in a state, that you will have a more responsive, more accountable government and a more responsive democracy, because you are not simply under the whim of political elites, but the power of the political elite is balanced out, granted, with a landed elite, but also then with the millions of citizens who, in their own small way, own not only landed property, but other items of personal property over which they have, for lack of a better word, sovereignty, and the ability then to tell government, no, this is mine, you can't have it. And here you can think about savings accounts, pension funds, any type of asset. When you have that ownership, you fundamentally have the ability to exclude other citizens, other people, but primarily government, from interfering with it. And that is power. That is real power in your hands. Even if you're poor, the ability, the potential of having something over which you exercise sovereignty is crucial for the proper functioning of democracy. But of course, the primary motivator always for strong and secure private property rights will be the prosperity that it produces, and simply the morality of it. We are human beings are on this planet, and depending on your religion or your worldview, the fact is we need to be able to tame the natural environment around us to survive. We need to be able to take from the environment and say, this is mine, I am utilizing it for my welfare. That's simply the reality. Without that, humanity has no potential to survive. And I think the experience in the Eastern Bloc over the previous century, where that element of human nature was collectivized, was put in the hands of the state, that showed that it simply cannot work. It cannot work to socialize private ownership to that extent. It has worked to lesser extents in some European social democracies, and that's okay. But fundamentally, wherever it works, there's a very large degree of respect for the private nature of property ownership. And South Africa and other African states must take this seriously. There is a record of what has worked and what has not worked, and private property rights have worked, and where they have been respected, those societies have worked. And South Africa and other African states must try to mimic that, to be completely honest, to see what successful countries have done in the past, and to try that here. And we're seeing that to a large degree in some states, South Africa included. But I'm not sure that the notion of we're going to use private property as our catalyst for success has really taken hold, and I think that it's certainly time for that to start happening.
Why are you optimistic about Africa's future?
It's very difficult to keep people down indefinitely. We've seen this since the development of the modern state, that every tyranny, every oppressive dictatorship has at some point come to an end. And what gives me great hope in the African context and in the recent historical context is that the countries that have been absolutely ravaged by socialism and communism were able to recover from the total destruction of those economic systems within a generation. You can think of Estonia, Bulgaria, even Russia, Ukraine, certainly. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, these countries adopted quite pro-market, free trade policies. Of course, never entirely free market, but certainly leaning in that direction. And they produced prosperity that was unheard of during their communist histories. A country like Hong Kong or Singapore, these were backwaters, and within very short order, they became economic powerhouses on the back of policies that favored free economic activity over central planning. So there's much to be despondent about in South Africa in particular, certainly in the rest of Africa, because our current situation is so dire. We just came out of these strict lockdowns. Insane inflation is gripping the world right now, but we're feeling the pinch in Africa, I think, a little bit harder. In South Africa, we have significant electricity shortages, and there's a lot of despair going around saying that, well, it's over now. The economy has been wrecked. It's every man for himself now. But I don't think that is ever really the case. If you look at the historical record, you can see that all that needs to happen is the society needs to recognize that the reason we are in this collapse is bad government policy. Almost without exception, it's bad government policy. And all that is necessary is to get rid of those policies, and even better, to implement policies that in fact respect private property rights and encourage free economic activity. And then you don't have to wait that long. You don't have to, it's not going to be a 400-year process to fix Africa or to fix South Africa, given that colonialism was this long 400-year process that apparently or ostensibly destroyed Africa. The recovery can be far, far quicker. And one of the reasons for this is that we can already see what works. We can go to Bulgaria, we can go to Estonia, we can go to Ukraine and see why those societies were harmed by socialism. And we can see how they came out of it. We have the evidence, we have the material at our disposal. And all we need to do is take it and, as far as possible, implement that here. And then I think within a generation, maybe even less, South Africa and Africa as a whole can become a real economic powerhouse. Even a country like Rwanda, coming out of a terrible genocide, in a short space of time, adopted economic policies that are friendlier to business, to markets, and it is quickly becoming one of Africa's standout economic nations. Botswana, for instance, as well as to a greater and lesser extent, always had a good economic policy. So the answers are there. All they need is to be taken. They need to be grabbed and implemented. And this is something that in South Africa, certainly there's winds. The winds of political change are in the air. The African National Congress, the governing party, in last year's municipal election was brought below 50% of electoral support for the first time in South Africa's democratic history. And that is an indication to many of us that in next year's general elections, where we elect parliament, the ANC will be brought below 50% for the first time. And this will open the door to a opposition-led coalition. And South Africa's opposition, with one exception, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, the rest of the opposition are all united around a market-based economy undergirded by strong private property rights. So there's a lot of hope in the air in South Africa, in addition to a lot of despair about the political future. And even if the ANC is not ousted next year, there's no reason to be defeatist. There's every reason to just know that this is a policy matter. We need to get the government out of place and replace it with better policy. And if that's not possible, we have a very resilient citizenry in South Africa, many of whom have started taking matters into their own hands. Potholes are being fixed privately, even though that's illegal. In many places, people are generating their own electricity. Crime in South Africa has always been out of control, but private associations are now taking over where the police have failed, establishing neighborhood watches. Private security firms. South Africa has private security that outnumbers the police and the army combined. So communities are taking action, and it doesn't matter where you are, you and your community will always know better than faraway politicians. So there is no reason to despair. Africa is in many ways the laboratory of what works and what doesn't. We've had a lot of experience in what doesn't work, and in the last 2 or 3 decades, we've really started tweaking with what does work. And I'm quite optimistic. I think that we just need to commit. We just need to choose those principles that have always worked without exception: private property rights, the free market, individual liberties, and the rule of law. We just need to grab tight those 4 principles, make them govern all the policy decisions that we make, and then I think you cannot but succeed.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to follow us on Twitter at @the_IATP. Also, hit the like and subscribe button below, and check out our website at www.theiatp.org.